Let's bring energy expert Ruse Moleshe to unpack what came out of that briefing a little earlier on. Ruse, good afternoon. Thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.
Good afternoon, Liza. Good afternoon to the viewers.
Perhaps on the back of what came out of the media briefing today, are you of the view that South Africa is on the right track to end the energy crisis in the near future, as it's also part of government's goal?
South Africa is on the right track as far as trying to resolve issues that relate to Eskom power plants, as that capacity is the biggest in the country. So without resolving those issues, obviously we'll not see a solution. However, we do need additional capacity to help us as we try to resolve the issues to be able to meet the gap that we have. So in that regard, we are relatively slow. And as the minister alluded to, we do need additional transmission capacity so that as we build new generation capacity, we're able to transmit that power from the new power plants to where it's supposed to go to the customers.
Thank you for those sentiments, because we also heard the capacity improved over the past week, but due to inclement weather conditions, that also may have affected the next coming days. And I wonder at this point what you could say to these developments and how Eskom, can or cannot keep its consistency as we're speaking.
So when you have a fragile system like we have in South Africa, with the supply not necessarily being able to meet demand, anything that interrupts the system is going to cause problems, because you don't have reserve capacity to be able to react to a situation. So flooding, for instance, is nothing new, really. Everywhere in the world it happens. It depends whether the system that you have is really resilient enough for you to be able to respond to that. So as South Africa, we don't have that system just yet. So we need to build that capacity to be able to be resilient so that any other event, whether it's weather or any other reason, plant breakdowns, we are able to respond accordingly.
Well, speaking about supply not meeting demand and there being no reserve capacity, how are we faring then against international best practices in addressing that gap?
At some point, Eskom had over 15% of a reserve margin, and internationally at that time, it was the aspiration was 25%. Obviously, these things change depending on situations. So, but the way you design an energy system is to make sure that you do have reserve capacity to be able to meet your emergencies when you have emergency, and to meet your peaking power. We are right now using hydro power for that, and we are using diesel for that. But we had a problem with Palmit, which is one of the plants that are meeting peaking power capacity. So when you don't have sufficient, should anything go wrong, then your system keeps on having issues. That's why it's very difficult to read weekly updates. It's good to have them, but it's not a good indicator of the long term.
Because I actually then wanted to look at the energy investments and both private and government options at this point, and whether you could share your thoughts on that. Also, the ripple effects that it's obviously having and is going to have on other sectors, including water, infrastructure, amongst others. What are the biggest concerns as we speak right now?
So the minister was talking about the transmission infrastructure with these investments. It's estimated that the investment that is required to build and strengthen the existing transmission infrastructure is almost close to the Eskom debt that you have, which is over 300 and almost 400 billion. That's what you require over a period of 10 years or so. So that is going to come from consumers, because consumers have to pay for that infrastructure to happen. Whether the model is to look at transmission projects, independent transmission projects, ultimately the consumer still has to pay. So all of the transmission or let's say infrastructure in the electricity sector that we are lacking, South Africa needs to pay for, and consumers will have to pay for. That will translate into a higher tariff. that is inevitable.
Ruse, let me conclude this conversation at this point, given the updates, given the interventions, given the communication at this point as well. Is it enough to inspire consumers and investors?
I mean, the minister is still talking about they're in the planning phases. They had a conference recently where they spoke to a number of financiers to potentially come up with a model for financing the transmission infrastructure. So you can see that they're still in the early stages. They still have to go back to government and say this is the plan. And then there still has to be plans around the procurement, potentially concessions of that transmission infrastructure. So it's a long-term game. You also need to make sure that there's land, there are servitudes secured, environmental impact assessments, you develop the project. So it's quite a long-term trajectory, but it's good that at least they're starting now.
Ruse, are there concerns about communities perhaps acting outside of democratic processes or constitutional arrangements meant to bridge the issues of local service delivery, issues related to the energy crisis? Anything coming through on that front?
So energy is a critical input to the economy. And we know that South Africa is affected by load shedding. It affects the economy, it affects communities at their level. Employment is very high in South Africa. So if we don't resolve the issue of load shedding and other related issues, it impacts on the telecommunications, it impacts on water provision. So if we don't resolve those issues, obviously, we may have a problem on our side with communities feeling like government is not doing enough to support them. And that could be a problem.
Ruse, thank you for your time with us on the SABC and for those sentiments.